Ukraine. I think we can't just skate past Ukraine. It's an issue that is not just close to your heart, it's part of your identity. You've got Ukrainian mother, a Russian father. You've just done some wonderful exchanges with your father, a 3-part conversation, and you disagree about that, but you model civil disagreement. And I think I've been watching a lot of mainstream media on Ukraine and Russia, and it's I wouldn't say it's unhinged, but they find it very, very difficult to inhabit both sides. And there's this sort of, maybe it's a case of World War II brain, where Zelensky is Churchill, Putin is Hitler, and Trump and Vance are Chamberlains for refusing to be as aggressive as maybe the Biden administration was. I think you bring a lot of you bring a very granular approach to what's going on there. At the time of recording, attempts are being made to negotiate with Moscow. It's not looking very hopeful. Where do you see this going? Is it just a completely futile effort by the Americans to get some peace negotiations going? And how do you see this ending?
Well, so many questions there. It's a difficult issue. I mean, there's quite a lot to unpack. So let me just take a few of the points, and they're quite separate. So first of all, on the framing of Zelensky's Churchill, if people want to make that argument, I actually don't have a particular problem with it. Zelensky very courageously marshaled his country in its defense with the consent of the people, by the way. The ordinary Ukrainian, having had their country invaded already in 2014 and essentially watched pieces of their land being taken away, were not prepared to let it happen again. That's just a fact. Whether people who like that or not is irrelevant. That is true. It's also true that it is because of his leadership that they were able to withstand an invasion by a much more powerful country. And it's because of his leadership that they were able to secure the help from the West in order to do that. My issue is that it was very clear to me from I said this on Question Time literally like 3 days after the conflict started, that the way this conflict inevitably would end, and I'm the most pro-Ukrainian person you're ever going to find, is a settlement negotiation. And what Ukraine needed to do was to give Russia a bloody nose, to deter further aggression, and then to come to the table and to say, look, you've got Crimea, we're probably not going to get it back ever. Let's just accept that that's happened, but in exchange, we're going to have permanent, physical security on the border. In other words, a peacekeeping force or something like that. That was always, for me, the objectives the Ukrainians were pursuing. And my issue with the Biden administration and others around Europe as well was, well, if you're saying Slava Ukraini, Zelensky is Churchill, then you have to give him the level of support that the Americans under Lend-Lease gave to Britain and the Soviet Union and other countries. In other words, you have to throw the kitchen sink at this and help the Ukrainians actually defend themselves. What we ended up with is, in my view, the worst of both worlds, which is partial support combined with partial practical support combined with very high levels of emotional support. In other words, no, please keep fighting and we'll give you just enough to not lose rapidly. And that's partly because in this emotional frenzy that we saw 3 years ago and since, none of these people actually asked themselves what the end result was going to be. How is this going to end? And therefore, what they do to people who ask questions about this, and this is very sad for me as someone who's very pro-Ukrainian, is they say, well, you're not supporting Ukraine sufficiently with your rhetoric. And they will criticize you for it. But no one ever asks them what they think should happen, because doing more of what we're currently doing is only hurting Ukraine. I mean, most people don't care about Russian soldiers dying. I care about both peoples being killed as a result of this war, but primarily Ukrainians, of course. I don't think the policy of just continuing the conflict without offering them support they need is rational. It doesn't help Ukraine to do that. So my first claim is that we failed to back up our words with practical action. And that is why the Ukrainians have ended up, despite their heroism, absolute heroism, despite hundreds of thousands, I expect at this point, of young men laying down their lives for their country bravely in a way that I think is to be celebrated and deserves all the praise that we can give them. Despite that, I don't think the result we've got to is what any of us would have wanted, because that support wasn't given to them properly. So that's the first argument that I would say. The second argument is about what, a lot of people like to argue about NATO expansion, and I think it's a perfectly valid point to point this out. The one thing that never gets asked of those people, and I think it's a very important thing to ask, is if NATO hadn't expanded eastwards, where do you think Vladimir Putin's tanks or his influence would be now in Eastern Europe? And we know from history, we know from pure geopolitics analysis that Russia expands westwards every time it can, for all sorts of economic and historical and geographical reasons. It needs to expand westwards to feel more secure. So if NATO hadn't expanded, well, Vladimir Putin might not be in war in Ukraine because he might be in control of all of Eastern Europe. And is that a price we were willing to pay for that? That's a whole different conversation that seems to me never gets had. In terms of the negotiations, I think negotiations at this point are necessary, but I've said for a long time, including prior to the election of President Trump, that in my very non-expert assessment, I don't see how you can have a real negotiation when you keep signaling that you're desperate for negotiations to go as quickly as possible. And also when you're frankly unwilling to have a stick as well as a carrot. The Trump administration's offering seems to be, we'll send this guy who doesn't know anything about Ukraine over to Moscow. He'll be really nice to President Putin. We'll say that Putin's not a murderer. He's not a dictator. He's a great guy and we want to do business with him. But what do you do when he then inevitably starts messing you around, because that's in his interest? He knows you want to wrap this up quickly. He knows you don't care really about the outcome. So you're then in a position where you're increasingly forced to demand more and more concessions from Ukraine without being able to demand anything of Russia in return. And that's essentially where the negotiations are currently ending up. Russia is basically going, oh, you want a deal? Okay, well, get the Ukrainians to give this up and to give this up and to give this up and to give this up. We want them to have an army that's incapable of defending their country at the end of this. We don't want any foreign, forces on the ground, etc. So my concern is that the deal the Ukrainians laid down their lives for is not likely to be forthcoming, given the way that the American administration is approaching this. And for that reason, I think there is some merited criticism of that approach, while also, I wrote a whole article and did a very popular video about why Zelensky really messed up in the Oval Office. So I really tried to have a balanced perspective on this. But as I currently look at this, my sense is we're heading to a very bad deal for Ukraine and therefore the world. And this is why I say, James, why is it a bad deal for the world? The first and most obvious thing, I think, to anyone who follows this even remotely closely is Ukraine was in a position where it was encouraged to give up the nuclear weapons it had in its possession. Now, there's some debate about, did they have command and control? Separate conversation. The fact of the matter is, if we live in a world in which powerful countries can invade smaller countries, and there is no, the world policeman has said, I'm not interested in policing, I'm done. I was discredited by beating up Iraq and Afghanistan and messing around in Libya and messing around in those places. I'm taking a step back. I've got stuff to look after at home. I've got 3 kids well, then you end up in a world in which everyone needs to get a gun. And then the risk of nuclear proliferation seems to me utterly inevitable, because it would be the most logical thing for every small country to pursue. If the Americans aren't going to protect us from Russia invading or China invading or whoever invading, we have to get the most powerful deterrent we possibly can. So there's the risk of nuclear proliferation. And then, of course, if Ukraine comes out of this negotiation with no security other than some words on a piece of paper, I think it's inevitable that it will be invaded again down the line, at which point we're back where we started, but worse.